on the phone Micah Uetricht, author of Strike for America, Chicago takes on Chicago teachers versus austerity, also the editor, a web editor of In These Times. Micah, welcome to the program.
Glad to be here.
What happened yesterday in Chicago? I mean, this is I don't know if we can call it an upset because there isn't necessarily a victory, but it's certainly a big surprise. Rahm Emanuel had a war chest of $15 million and couldn't get to 50% of the vote.
It's definitely safe to call it an upset. I mean, the very people who were working for the campaign of Chuy Garcia, none of them seemed to expect that this was going to happen. And, all of the headlines in the dailies, like the Chicago Sun-Times, use words like embarrassment, that Rahm Emanuel couldn't beat this guy who, frankly, a good chunk of Chicagoans don't even really know who this guy, Chuy Garcia, is, who was up against Rahm. To say that he had $15 million is actually sort of inaccurate. He had $15 million for his own campaign, but then he had another $15 million in a PAC, a super PAC called Chicago Forward, that was being used to target city council members who were not carrying out his agenda on the city council, to target the progressives on the city council. And even that huge amount of money that they had for those races couldn't produce strong results on the council either. So it undoubtedly is a serious upset for Emanuel, and I would say for the kind of rightward moving Democratic Party politics that he represents.
Yeah, I want to talk about both the I guess you could call them aldermen in Chicago. I want to talk about those races and the role of the CTU, the Chicago Teachers Union, which, of course, you've written about and you came on this program we discussed in the past. Let's just start with who is Chuy Garcia, A, and B, I mean, and I guess at one point Garcia was at least prodded or encouraged to enter the race by Karen Lewis. Tell us about that dynamic, because at one point it looked like Karen Lewis, the former head of the Chicago Teachers Union, was actually going to run and was going to have a decent sized war chest against Emanuel.
That's right. So to sort of the first question about who he is, Chuy Garcia is he's on the Cook County Board of Commissioners. He's somebody who has a long history in Chicago politics and a pretty unimpeachable record as a strong progressive in Chicago politics. He was involved in the Harold Washington administration in the 80s. Harold Washington, of course, was the first African-American mayor of Chicago, who was elected in the 80s, and he was a strong ally of him and was elected alderman, city council member for his ward on the southwest side, which is a heavily Latino area of Chicago. He's in the neighborhood of Little Village. And he's a guy who has paid the price for his progressivism in the past. I mean, he was targeted by this now defunct organization called the Hispanic Democratic Organization, which was the Latino arm of the daily Democratic machine, who forced him out of office, after, I think, one term in office. So he, like I said, he's a guy who's always he's paid the price for his progressivism, and he has no one can really he's kind of a squeaky clean kind of guy in terms of his record. But what makes this race a lot different from other race like say Bill de Blasio's victory in New York City. Is that it's not like in New York, Bill de Blasio sort of harnessed this resentment and this anger that was building up around the city. That people were desperate for a more progressive direction. In this case, it wasn't an individual sort of harnessing that, but it was a social movement that produced Chuy Garcia's campaign and really is responsible for him forcing this runoff. As you mentioned, Karen Lewis was considering running for mayor and by all accounts was ready to announce the fact that she was going to run for mayor. I went to several town hall style meetings that she held that certainly felt like they were of a potential mayoral candidate, somebody who was about to take a run at Emanuel. There were polls that had shown that in head-to-head races she would beat Rahm Emanuel pretty strongly. And of course, the reason for that, the reason that there is so much of this anger against Rahm Emanuel and the support for someone like Karen Lewis is because of what her union has done in this city over the last few years. Without the Chicago Teachers Union strike in 2012, there is no Chuy Garcia, forcing Rahm Emanuel into a runoff this week. That is the most important thing that has happened in this city in the last couple of years, and it has affected a sea change in politics in the city, frankly. Chuy wasn't planning on running for mayor, and it wasn't until Karen Lewis fell sick with a brain tumor just before she was about to formally announce that his name was even discussed as someone who could run. And he's very open about the fact that he decided to run because after Karen dropped out, she and the CTU and other progressive groups came to him and said, we need you to run. He doesn't make any bones about the fact that he's running at the behest of these progressive elements in the city. And that's a unique dynamic. It's a sort of movement. The movement in Chicago, these social movements that are led by the Chicago Teachers Union have affected this sea change in the city. And you have a candidate who openly says, yes, I decided to run because people from the movement asked me to.
Right, and you had multiple, CTU members are involved in runoffs. I mean, this is what's really fascinating about this is that and when we spoke to you about that strike, one of the things that became clear was that the union had laid the groundwork for years in developing these relationships outside of their membership and including agendas that were not limited to those that directly affected their members, but rather they followed this social justice union model and created these relationships in the community. And it appears that we're still seeing the implications of that. I mean, that's not. I guess that organizing has not ended, and it also the ties that have been created seem to be now a political force that is far outgrown, I guess, the what could be a limited agenda for teachers.
That's right. So two of the essential aspects of the CTU and what makes it different from most other unions that I write about in the book are, one, its commitment to a broad social justice agenda, and two, its involvement and training and development of its rank and file leaders and its small d democratic character. Regarding the first one, social justice issues, the union has for years now worked very closely along with progressive community groups, groups fighting gentrification in neighborhoods, groups that were working on fighting school closures before the CTU was really focused on that. And the years of relationships with those community groups has led to the creation of organizations like United Working Families, which played a critical role in this election, the Grassroots Illinois Action. These are groups that are kind of collaborative efforts between the CTU, one other progressive union in the city, the SEIU, Healthcare Illinois, Indiana, and neighborhood level groups. And so they've helped play this role of bringing all of these progressive elements together, and they've got people out campaigning for these progressive candidates. And some of the progressive candidates that they're campaigning for, as you mentioned, are actually rank and file teachers, which speaks to this other aspect of what makes the CTU different, is that the CTU is not just Karen Lewis standing up and giving great progressive sort of militant speeches about how awful Rahm is and the kind of change we need in the city. It's easy to focus on that because she's a very big personality in the city. But the union has actually focused on developing these classroom level teachers. They're the ones who led the strike that happened in 2012. They're the ones who carry out the union's agenda. And then in this election that you have, as you mentioned, I think there were a total of 5 races where teachers ran, 3 of which forced runoff elections. And these are classroom teachers who have never run for office before, who have been inspired by what they've seen in their union, their ability to make these kind of changes. I spent election day watching what was going on in the 33rd Ward with a high school teacher named Tim Megan, who was up against Deb Mell, who nationally the name is not known very well, but in Chicago, the Mell family is this sort of political dynasty, this machine family. She was given this office after it was handed to her by her father, who had been in office for eons, and is a strong Daley and then Rahm supporter. She votes 100% of the time with the mayor, literally 100% of the time. And he's this teacher who decides to run against her, against one of the most powerful political families in Chicago, and forces a runoff with her. So it just shows, and not to say, there's these 3 races that were forced into runoffs, but then also, the CTU members, the teachers themselves, and other education workers were the ones who were, working in Chuy Garcia's campaign, working in these other aldermanic campaigns. I mean, they are the ones who have, who can give credit for the victories, the progressive victories that did happen in this election.
And just to remind people too, we said earlier that Rahm had $15 million in his own campaign funds, in addition to the outside, the $15 million from the outside expenditures. And Chuy Garcia had about $1.2 million, and we're talking about 15 to 1, not including, or 30 to 1, depending on how you want to calculate that, not including the fact that Emanuel had a multi-year head start on Chuy Garcia. My understanding is that you can also see where these school closings that Rahm Emanuel oversaw impacted the election. But before we get there, give us a sense of what are the chances that Emanuel loses? I mean, I know that the turnout was incredibly low, or relatively low, for this election. The next one happens when? When does the runoff, and what is the sense as to whether or not Emanuel can lose? And again, we should remind people, this is going to have, even this, I think, as it is now, is having sort of large reverberations around the country. Whether or not the narrative is actually the case or not. This is seen as sort of the next chapter of this narrative about Bill de Blasio and the sort of movement left within the Democratic Party.
Right. So the runoff election will be held on April 7th. If you had asked me did Chuy stand it, was there any chance of a runoff even happening in this election, I would have probably told you no before Tuesday, and I would have been joined by the majority of people who were working on his campaign who would have probably admitted that no, he doesn't stand a chance, and then lo and behold, he forces this runoff. So I'm not. I don't know if I don't want to make a prediction because it feels like it's not possible. Then again, so did his runoff on Tuesday. The one thing that I think, from Chuy's perspective, having these extra 6 weeks, because it's 6 weeks until the runoff election. This can only benefit him. I was on a bus yesterday coming to work, and I heard some people talking about, you hear this guy Chuy forced this election with Rahm, this runoff with Rahm. People don't even really know who this guy is. They're calling him Chuy in public, right? So having this extra 6 weeks can only benefit him because it will give him more time to introduce himself to the voters of Chicago. He, even in terms of when he decided to run in this election, it was very late in the game because, of course, Karen Lewis had been planning to run all this time, and then it was almost November before he even decided that he was going to jump in. So, and for someone who is not, as I mentioned, a real household name around Chicago, it's really a testament to how dissatisfied people are with this mayor and with these sort of neoliberal policies that he's been pushing, these free market policies, that they are willing to send him to a runoff against this guy who is not even really very well known. The one important thing to note, though, is that Garcia did not perform particularly well in African American neighborhoods in the city, despite the fact that the school closings have primarily impacted African American neighborhoods, and much of the free market agenda that Rahm Emanuel has carried out has the African American communities have borne the brunt of it. He did not perform particularly well in a lot of those neighborhoods. That's not completely true on a sort of ward by ward or neighborhood by neighborhood level, but overall it's the case. And it's in part because people don't know him, but also because President Obama was here stumping for Rahm just before the election began. Rahm was bringing in Magic Johnson came to the city, and Rahm is in a press conference shaking hands with Magic Johnson, who's sort of tacitly endorsing him for mayor. And so I think that is less. Again, I think the main reason for those numbers of strong numbers of African Americans backing Rahm it has in part to do with the fact that people don't know who Chuy is. And so my assumption is that over those next 6 weeks, he's going to be focusing very heavily on getting his name out there to those African American communities in the city.
And we should say there was 1, 2, 3 other candidates who garnered anywhere from almost 3% to almost 11% of the vote. Willie Wilson got 11% of the vote. And so that African-American vote is going to be really important because that made up, as far as my understanding is, a large part of Willie Wilson's support. And so that's going to make a big difference. I mean, is there talk that President Obama is going to come back again, or does the President of the United States not come back for a runoff? In other words, I'm not going to put my... I don't know that I necessarily, it's one thing to come in at the beginning, but if he can't get over this hump, then maybe this is not somewhere where I really want to invest my time.
Well, I'm not aware of many sitting U.S. presidents intervening in mayoral elections like this.
In the first place, right?
History, so I think we might be in uncharted territory here. I don't know whether he'll come back or not. I haven't heard any rumors of that. But I think that the mayoral race may indeed be won based on who can get those votes from those other 3 candidates, 2 of whom were African Americans, and Willie Wilson and Doc Walls, and the third, Bob Fioretti, is somebody who has a pretty long history of activism and support of being involved in organizing in African American communities in the city. So that'll be the crucial test, and I'm not sure which of them have pledged their support to Chuy or Rahm, or said they're going to stay out of it. I can't imagine Fioretti won't back Chuy, but the other ones I'm not so sure about.
Interesting. All right. Well, Micah, I appreciate your catching us up on this. And when there was talk that Karen Lewis was going to be in the race, I mean, I think there was a real sense that this was going to be a national race, at least for progressives across the country, because of the animosity to Rahm Emanuel. I think, sort of not just personally, I don't know if that was really it as much as what he's represented in terms of the privatization and the neoliberal agenda. And so this is pretty exciting stuff. Micah Uetricht, thank you so much for keeping us up to date, and we'll touch back with you in April.
Sounds great.